Okay people, check this out. Let's talk about bowls, not the Super Bowl, but even better, wooden bowls, especially these recycled skateboard bowls. One of the main reasons why you might see a lot of people making bowls out of recycled skateboard is because of the shape of these nose and tails. The size of these nose and tails are roughly 7 to 8 inches in width and about 4 to 5 inches tall. It's not flat or straight, but when you laminate a bunch of them together, it fits nicely to form a solid bowl blank. And because each skateboards will give you 2 nose and tails, I have a ton of these in my shop at the moment, probably about 400 nose and tails. Now, I'm not going to turn all of them into a bowl, but I decided to prepare all the nose and tails that I have and make something out of it throughout the whole year. So over the last few weeks, I sanded all these noses and tails down to bare wood. I used to use carving discs, but I realized it's so much cheaper and faster to just buy cheap bulk 60 grit flat discs. The paint, stickers, finish, and the glue residues clog up the disc and dulls the carving disc in few months, and it's pretty expensive. So these cheap flap discs are less than $1 per disc. So when I feel the flap disc getting clogged, I can just change it to a new one and I can move a whole lot faster without any resistance. As for laminating these noses and tails together, I'm laminating 40 noses and tails at a time. I like using epoxy and my bottle jack press to laminate these together into solid blocks. And since epoxy can be a little slippery, I like to just dry clamp these together first and mark a straight line so I could align them in the press and make sure they're straight. And here I'm just removing the blocks that I laminated the night before and clearing up the press to laminate a new block. And I'm using 20-ton bottle jack, and that seems to be enough pressure to flatten out these concaves on the skateboards. Now, when it comes to laminating skateboards together, I like to use epoxy. And yes, you can still use glue, but from my experience, epoxy cuts easier than glue. Also, there's a ton of chips and voids and gaps on these nose and tails, so the epoxy fills that up and turns it into a solid block. Another thing, epoxy has a longer open time, and since I'm laminating about 40 of these nose and tails at a time, it usually takes about 15 to 20 minutes to go into the press. And with glue, the longest open time would be about 15 minutes for Type Bond 3. I'm not too sure, but I'm pretty sure it's 15 minutes. And you know how much it sucks to sand all these down just to get a bad lamination, and you just wasted 2 to 3 hours of your day sanding. So even if it's more costly, I would recommend using epoxy to laminate these skateboards together. And if you want to save some money, make sure to use the link down below and get a nice little discount from TOTALBOAT. When I'm laminating these on the press, I like to temporarily clamp this strip of wood to align these nose and tails. And I can keep them straight following the line that I drew earlier. And I usually leave them in the press overnight and let it cure for at least minimum of 24 hours. It's very important that you let it fully cure before working on it. And that's how I make these solid blocks out of these nose and tails. I ended up prepping about 320 nose and tails, and I'm only using 2 of these blocks to make bowls, and the rest will be used for something else. And I couldn't wait on one of them, so I cut them into veneers to see how much material I could get out of these blocks. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on what I'm going to be making with these blocks. Now, if you look at the block, there's only one fairly flat surface that I could use to break this block down safely. So I use a sled and get a nice straight cut on the edge so I could reference that fresh cut to the cross-cut fence, and I could cross-cut this solid block in half. And when it comes to bowl blanks, you want to make sure it's proportional. Since this bowl will be no more than 6 to 7 inches in diameter, there's really no reason to keep this at 4 to 5 inches in thickness. So I cut this down into 2 different bowl blanks. One nice solid bowl blank with about 2.5 inches in thickness, and the rest of the block, which I'll be turning into a little tray with epoxy and broken edges showing. I just sent it through the drum sander to make it nice and smooth and draw the biggest circle that I could draw on these blanks. I used to use a jig to get a perfect circle, but since I don't feel like changing the bandsaw blade, I could just roughly cut them into a circle. I'm also cutting a small circle out of plywood to use as the bottom of the bowls. This way, I don't have to waste any more of the skateboard material. I can just use CA glue to hold it together and also drill out a 3/8 inch hole to mount the bowl to the chuck. Now, before I start turning on the lathe, I just want to thank Harvey Industries for sending me this lathe. This lathe is called Turbo T40, a 14 by 24 inch wood lathe with servo motor and variable speed control from 60 RPM to 4300 RPM. And I had it for about a year now, and I think this is the perfect size lathe for any hobbyist. The size is 14 inches by 24 inches, which is more than enough for bowls or smaller legs, but you can add an extension bed that will turn this into a 42-inch long lathe, which will allow you to turn something long like table legs. Now, one of the best features about this lathe for me is the ability to swivel the head of the lathe. It is so much easier to carve the inside of the bowls, and there's so many different positions that I can set so I have better control of my tools that I'm using. And overall, everything is solid, beefy, stable, quiet, modern, and most of all, just works great. And if you're in the market for a new lathe, I would highly recommend this lathe. And if you have any questions about this lathe, let me know down in the comments and I'll do my best to answer it. Okay, so let's get started on turning these bowls. First, I have the Nova Protect G3 chuck mounted on the lathe. I got it from Rockler and they have it on sale from time to time, and it's probably the best and the most sturdy chuck I have ever purchased, and I highly recommend it. I can then thread the bowl blank into the wood worm screw and secure it with the tailstock, and then I could adjust the tool rest and start turning. Personally, I like using these carbide tipped lathe tools since I don't have to resharpen these tools. And all I'm doing here is making the bowl blank perfectly round before I can start shaping it into a bowl. And one of the best ways to check if it's perfectly round is resting the tool on the top of the wood, and if it doesn't wobble or bounce, you're perfectly round. And I can do the same for the plywood piece that I glued on. Now, as for the shape of the bowl, there's really no wrong or right way to shape it. And usually it just naturally comes to you and the bowl kind of speaks to you. And I know this sounds kind of cliche, but I really don't have any plan at this moment, and I'm just turning it and roughly shaping it into a bowl shape. And this process is one of the most enjoyable parts of turning because you're really just figuring it out as you go. And especially with these recycled skateboards, you could kind of manipulate the colors of these bowls and shape the lines just by turning it and shaping it. Now, since this bowl blank is technically made out of plywood, there's going to be some chips and voids, and especially around the edges. I tried to take the shallowest passes, but sometimes it gets caught and chips even more. And the best way that I found to get rid of these chips is to just sand the bowl down. So I just go straight into a 60 grit sandpaper, and I sand up to 600 grit, and instead of putting on the finish now, I decided to put on the finish once I'm finished with both sides and the bowl is complete. Once I'm finished with the bottom of the bowl, I can take the bowl off the screw and take the wood worm screw out and mount the bottom of the bowl into the chuck, and for now, I'm just barely tightening it. I can then push the bowl into the chuck firmly with the tailstock, and then I can secure and tighten the bowl into the chuck. This way, it will be right on the center and the bowl won't wobble when you turn on the lathe. Now, like I mentioned before, one of the best features and a must-have for a lathe is the ability to swivel the head. It makes it so much easier for you to carve the inside of these bowls. Also, this thing has a 12-inch tool rest, which I don't even have to move once I have it set up. Now, when it comes to carving out the inside of the bowl, it's a little trickier than the outside. You generally want to follow the same shape as the outside and roughly the same thickness all around. And the tricky part is, the thinner the edges get, the more fragile it becomes. And the worst case scenario is the whole thing comes apart and pretty much blows up on your face. But luckily, none of them did, and so my advice would be to go as slow as possible and take very little off at a time. And if you're getting really thin and want to go extra safe, just use sandpaper. I don't think it's worth it to carve it as thin as possible and risk getting it blown in your face or wasting the whole bowl blank that you just made, which took you 2 days to make in the first place. Another thing that I want to mention about carving the inside of the bowl is that I like to use the square carbide lathe tool to get the most of the insides carved out, and at the end I take light passes with the circle carbide lathe tool and get it into its final shape. And just like the outside, there's going to be a lot of chips and voids, and maybe even more so than the outside. So I leave enough room so I can sand down the inside of the bowl to the same thickness. And I give myself about 1/4 inch wall thickness, and anything smaller than that might be a little too fragile. And once I'm finished with sanding, I could cut the bowl off the chuck by using a parting tool. Now I'm doing something that's not really a good idea, and most wood turners would probably hate me for doing this, but I want to have a flat bottom bowls with no rims. So I use the drum sander to get the plywood residue sanded and make it nice and flat. Now those are just the bowls from the solid blocks of the nose and tails. And moving on to these little cutoffs, I just couldn't throw these away and thought it would look pretty cool if I could just epoxy the voids and fill it up so you could see through the bowl and see the broken edges. And I figured I could probably get a small tray out of it, so I started to drill the inside of the block, and then I could use the circle cutting jig on my bandsaw and cut out a circle. Now, instead of chucking this thing on the lathe and start turning and pray to God that everything will be fine, I decided to carve it into a rough shape using my Arbortech carving disc. This should make it 1,000 times safer to turn on the lathe, and it should prevent from splitting or chipping off this whole bowl blank. So I thread the bowl blank into the lathe and start turning the outside. I get it into the final shape that I like and sand it down to a 600 grit. I glued a small piece of plywood and turned that round to flip the bowl to carve the inside of the bowl. And carving the inside is even more fragile for these little trays, so I make sure to take my time and go slowly. And I can sand the inside up to 600 grit and cut off the tray using the parting tool. Now, few of the trays didn't need additional epoxy, but few of them did, so I decided to add a little bit of color into it. And another thing about turning epoxy is it turns pretty smoothly, but it gets everywhere. So I turned the outside and the inside of these little trays and finally sanded the bottoms of these trays using a drum sander. Now let me tell you the worst thing you could do as a wood turner or a woodworker. The worst thing you could do is leaving tool marks on the wood or even sanding marks. So take your time and hand sand your projects and remove any sanding marks or tooling marks or any imperfections. Now as for the finish, I'm using Rubio Monocoat for durable protection. It's really easy to put on the finish, which is just wiping it on and wiping it off. And that's how I made these bowls out of a bunch of nose and tails. I have these up on my website, which is woby.design. And that's it for this video. I'm going to be making more things out of these nose and tails, and I already have 4 different blocks ready to go. So make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and comment down below what else I should be making with these nose and tails. Thanks again, and until next time, bye!